All right, so today we have the causes of the Great Depression. What does that button do? Okay, so very quickly what I'm going to do is talk about what the Great Depression is. The Great Depression is a time period from 1929 to 1941-ish, and I say ish because it roughly ends when World War II begins for the United States, but it's not an immediate relief. And so really the Great Depression is when we go from prosperity with people dressing like this and looking super happy to disparity where people are looking really depressed and poor and hungry and starving. During the Great Depression, it's important to know that a large number of banks and businesses fail. 25% of all workers in the United States are unemployed, and that's it's really larger if you look at uneducated workers like factory workers, farmers, versus people who, doctors, lawyers, etc. So it's really unequally distributed. Massive amounts of Americans are starving and homeless, and farmers, their incomes plummet, and many go bankrupt. And so what we're going to look at today is how all of this happens. The first cause of the Great Depression is buying goods on credit. And I know with your notes you have an acronym called BOOF. There's no real word I could spell with B-H-O-O-F. So if you can figure it out, please do. But the B is buying goods on credit. Basically, people spent more than they had, and then they couldn't pay back their debts. They assumed that because they were making a lot of money in the 1920s, that they would just continue to make a lot of money. And so they're not saving appropriately. They're buying a lot of things on credit cards or lines of credit. And then when they lose their job, they don't pay their credit back. And so as a result, when people aren't paying their credit cards back, you've got businesses are losing money on the sales, first off, because they're not getting paid, but they've still lost the good. And then consumers stop buying new items because they don't have the money. So not only are businesses losing the money because people have taken a product and not paid for it, but then people aren't buying new products. So it's like they're losing twice. The H is high tariffs discourage international trade. A tariff is the fee that, let's pause this. Okay, we should be good. So a tariff is a fee that somebody outside of the United States has to pay to get their goods inside of the United States to sell. So for example, if I live in Italy and I make fine china, to sell my fine china in the United States, I have to obviously put it on a ship and get it into the United States, and then at the border I have to pay a tax, which is a tariff, just to get it inside of the United States and have it be sold. The problem is that Hoover, the president, in 1930, right when the Great Depression starts, passes one of the highest tariffs in all of U.S. history. And as a result, people, especially in Europe, people stop trading with the United States because they can't afford to pay the tax and still sell their good, because as a result, it raises their overall price and nobody wants to buy that fine china anymore. So as a result, this tariff that he passes, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, reduces how many people are importing goods into the United States, and foreign governments get mad at our tariffs, so they raise their tariffs. And so now we can't sell American goods outside of the United States. So not only are Americans not buying the goods because they can't afford it, because they've lost their credit, but then nobody else outside of the U.S. is buying it because the prices are too high. The first O is overproduction in agriculture and industry. Basically, we made too much stuff. People aren't going to need 5 cars, for the most part. Maybe you do, but most people don't. We just keep producing and producing and producing because we can do so cheaply. And at a certain point, workers can't afford to buy these goods that they're creating, because they don't have those lines of credit anymore. But at the same point, when you create a lot of something, it drives the price down. And then if the price goes low enough, the business isn't making any money. So basically, we just made too much stuff. We also grew too much stuff. And this leads to something that we will talk a lot about, which is called the Dust Bowl. You start here. In the 1920s, the farmers are in debt, and they're in debt for a lot of reasons. But the big reason that they're in debt is that they are growing too much, and it is forcing prices down. So you've got farmers in debt, so what they do to make money is they grow more crops. However, the more crops that they grow, the more that they are taking nutrients out of the soil. And if you'll remember, the region that most of your farms are located in is the Great Plains, that Midwest Tornado Alley that we've talked a lot about. So when you deplete the soil of nutrients, you make it really light and fine. It's not that heavy, dark soil anymore. It's really light, fine soil, which is very dry and easily picked up by the wind, which creates something called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is basically, you get this huge drought in the Great Plains, and the soil is so dry and fine like dust that nothing grows, and you get dust storms and dust clouds, very much like you would think of sandstorms and sand clouds. Then we also have overspeculation on stocks, and this is a big one. Overspeculating is when you are kind of gambling with the stock market. So you are putting all of your money, or you're putting all of your loaned money, into stocks that aren't guaranteed to do well. They're risky. And so if they do well, that's fantastic. You made a lot of money because odds are nobody else put that bet out. But if they don't do well, then you've lost all that money. And if you've borrowed that money in the first place, now you're really in debt. So not only are people gambling with stocks, but they're spending money they don't have, and when you spend money you don't have on stocks, when you're borrowing, or when you're only putting a little bit of a percentage down, that's called buying on margin. So what happens is the stock market crashes, meaning that prices drop in the stock market, and everybody has to pay back all of these big loans that they had borrowed to buy these stocks in the first place, and they don't have the money. And because they don't have the money, they're not going to buy new stocks. And so because nobody is buying these stocks and they're just sitting there on the market waiting to be sold, the prices keep dropping and dropping and dropping, meaning that people are losing money and losing money and losing money. And then lastly, you have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States government. Essentially, their job is, you can't go put your money in the Federal Reserve, but their job is to oversee all of the banks in the United States and make sure that they're being careful and safe with people's money and that they're not going to destroy the economy. The problem is that the Federal Reserve was not doing their job. They were supposed to make sure that banks were holding enough money actually within the bank, and they were supposed to make sure that banks were keeping interest rates low, and they just didn't do it. And so what happens is nobody's there to make sure that the banks have the appropriate amount of money actually located within the bank, and they let banks do whatever they want. And so a lot of banks were losing people's money, and the Fed let it happen. And so when the stock market crashes, and when people have to pay back all of their credit cards and their loans, they go to the bank to take out their money, and the bank runs out and closes and goes out of business. And so people, thousands of people across the United States, lose everything because the bank had lost everything. And the big thing you need to know is that when you put your money in a bank, it doesn't just keep that exact amount of cash for you in a box somewhere in the back of the bank. The bank notes that you have that much located within the system of their bank, but they actually take a large amount of your cash and they put it in investments. And that's how they're able to give people loans. They're actually loaning out your money. But the problem was that the Federal Reserve at this time wasn't overseeing it to make sure that they were making good investments. They were making bad investments, and so they were losing the money and having no way to pay people back. All right, those are your 5 causes of the Great Depression. Make sure you filled out your lesson guide, and good luck.